You're listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
Hey there, and I hope you're doing great. Thanks so much for checking out my show, Straight to Video. Now, as many regular listeners to this show well know, most episodes are filled with either 80s pop culture talk or a deep dive into hair metal, but occasionally I'll take a left turn and hopefully serve up something a little different, but a chat you enjoy just as much nonetheless, and today is one of those, and it's a real treat. As many of you know, I have family who live out in the wonderful US state of Mississippi, a place I used to spend my summer holidays and somewhere very close to my heart. Well, located in historic downtown Vicksburg, Mississippi, is a fantastic art gallery owned and run by internationally recognized artist H.C. Porter. I've been a fan of HC's work for a few years now, and I thought it would be cool to bring her onto the show to chat about her unique mixed media artwork and share what is an incredible journey and shine some light on some of the amazing stories, characters and events which her work has captured. With artwork described as Andy Warhol with southern roots, H.C. Porter combines her love and talent for photography, silkscreen printing and painting to produce unique, thought-provoking images that capture the life of their subject and each tell their own story. HC's work has been captured in two amazing books, Backyards and Beyond, which documented and told the story of Mississippians the First Year after Hurricane Katrina, and more recently Blues at Home, which documents living blues legends in Mississippi. She's a wonderful storyteller, not just in her artwork, but also when chatting, so I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like one of my earlier straight-to-video chats with Mississippi folklorist Bill Ferris, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Before I talk, show some love and support for the mighty Dead Skull Coffee and their great rock and roll ground and full bean coffee by dropping by their website, deadskullcoffee.co.uk, and if you add the discount code STV on checkout, you can bag 15% off your order. How great is that? Alright, this was a real treat for me to chat with H.C. Porter and truly hope it makes you want to check out her artwork too. If you want to learn more, I recommend tracking down the two books I mentioned, Backyards and Beyond and Blues at Home, or just head on over to hcporter.com or find her wonderful gallery on Facebook. There's lots to dive into, but for now, please enjoy my straight-to-video chat with H.C. Porter.
Ta-ta!
We did it!
Across the seas!
All the way. What are we, like 3,500 miles? How you been?
Well, insane. You know, it's just the way things roll around here. Always too much to do and not enough time to do it.
Exactly. Just the days and weeks are flying by. I don't know if everybody slowed down during all the lockdown pandemic thing. We're trying to get back up to speed. I've no idea.
Well, what's been happening over there? Just podcast after podcast?
Yeah, getting back into the swing of things. It took me a couple of weeks to get the motivation and the energy back, but now I'm back, so it's all good.
Good.
I'm glad we got to hook this up. I really appreciate you doing it. I think it'd be fun. Well, I'm excited to learn about your journey a little bit and hopefully introduce your artwork to people over here. You're coming to us from your own studio and gallery in Vicksburg, Mississippi, where you call home, but you're originally from Jackson, the state's capital, which for those maybe over here that don't know, Vicksburg is, I think it's about, is it like 40 miles to the west of Jackson, right on the border of Louisiana? In fact, your studio in downtown Vicksburg, it's right on the Mississippi, right, between the two states.
That's what I was going to say. I'm sitting on the Mississippi River. So all of you Huck Finn fans out there know what I'm talking about. When you've got muddy brown water running about 300 yards from the studio, it's inspirational as a visual artist. So I know it inspired all my characters, my blues men, all those years too. But not my home, as you said. Originally, I'm from Jackson, Mississippi, but Vicksburg, I've been here since 2005.
Had you been to Vicksburg much growing up? Or, I mean, it's not that far away. So was it somewhere you'd been to previously?
I don't know if you have mandatory field trips in school in the UK, but Vicksburg is a renowned Civil War national military park. Of course, a turning point battle was fought in Vicksburg, and as school children, we're bused to Vicksburg. You know, it's 26 miles of military monuments and historic sites, and we're allowed to roam free. And, you know, that's the only real memory I have of Vicksburg.
History lesson.
Exactly. But I fell in love with it. The building is 1875. So I moved my studio. I'd been on Millsaps Avenue for 20 years, and I moved to Vicksburg because I fell in love with the building, and then realized now I'm living in a small town of about 25,000 with lots of historic energy. We like to call it hipstery.
Yeah.
Instead of just history, we try to combine it, make it a little bit hip. So I'm part of the hip end, I hope, even at this ripe age, but we won't say. So
I love it. What comes to mind to you from growing up in Jackson, like during the 70s and all that kind of thing? Was you always into art from a very young age? Because your mom was an artist too, right?
You have done your homework. Yes. I have known from the second grade that I wanted to be an artist. My mother was sort of a weekend Sunday painter. She never did it professionally because her parents encouraged her to have, make a living. So she was a business major, but she was always painting and taking local college courses, and she would encourage me. She put me in some private lessons too at an early age. And I learned to draw Snoopy, and his little buddy Woodstock. And the key to that, though, was that I was told that it was good. So it's the encouragement that we receive that plants those seeds at those ages, right? So that sort of set me off. I had really actually wanted to be a ventriloquist.
Wow, where did that come from?
Exactly. And I was a really poor ventriloquist. I was actually given a Charlie McCarthy doll. Those of you that are my age might remember that craze of ventriloquism. And I thought that was going to be my life's calling. And thankfully, art raised its head. So, I left ventriloquism behind and pursued art.
What did your dad do?
He sat around saying, that doesn't look like an apple.
Wow.
He was very encouraging. He was a contractor. He had a business that was very industrial and
brutally realistic at times then.
Exactly. Yes. He was very encouraging. Both my parents, whatever you want to do, just do it. So I pursued art. And I was fortunate to have art in high school and competed. We have something called National Scholastic Arts competitions. So each school submits their art from individual artists, and you're competitive with other students. And by the time you're a senior in our high school system, you can compete against other seniors with an entire portfolio of work. And that portfolio won me a scholarship to the University of Alabama.
Is that how scholarships work? It's always been a bit of a grey area for me. I didn't realise. Is that how it works? You compete with other students?
Well, I don't know how it works. If you're great in soccer, I guess you get a soccer school wants you to go there. And I happened to be recognized for my art at that point in my life. So Alabama, I guess they were trying to build their, students' body and their artists. And they offered to dangle some money. And so I would have gone to a Mississippi state school as a Mississippi native, but Alabama, stamped the checks.
How much was photography involved in your path at this point?
I know that's an interesting thing because my work in general is a combination now of my photography, silkscreen. So I'm printmaking from my photographs, and then I paint back in on top of it. It's acrylic paint and Prismacolor pencil. And that has emerged as my style. So when somebody sees my work, they're like, oh, I know that. That's an H.C. Porter. Well, it was a long time coming. And yes, photography was an early love. My mom actually had been given an Olympus. This is way before digital, as you mentioned, the 70s. I won't mention any other decades, but yeah, the 70s. My mom was given this manual SLR Olympic camera, and she promptly looked at me and said, I really don't want this. Would you like it? And my hands were held out. Yes, yes, yes. So I took some local classes, and actually they were adult ed. I was probably 14 or 15, and I was exposed to the darkroom.
Right.
Not just how do I use this camera now, but the actual, all of it.
See the images come to life from like a blank.
Yes. So to have your negatives and, developing your film and putting it in, and as you said, seeing it all come to life, I just absolutely fell in love with it. Plus, again, it was a dark room and I was 15, 16. So your boyfriends get to hang out in the dark room too. So that was always fun.
You went there.
Yeah, so I loved having a dark room in high school. So photography, I learned to really fell in love with documenting what was around me. Of course, you become the high school photographer for everything too. You're tapped to all the football games, basketball, whatever. So that was part of my early years too. But at Alabama, I was a photography major and a painting major with an English minor.
Was they just like kind of running as two parallel subjects, or was there a crossover while she was in university?
No, it was photography. Again, we had a dark room in college. I had a camera, and then I was taking sculpture and studio painting. It wasn't until I graduated from college that I started apprenticing with the gentleman that used silkscreen in his work. And silkscreen was what finally brought the two together. So his work was sort of, you won't remember because this was in the 70s, but with an artist named Leroy Neiman. He did the Olympics, these big, splashy, colorful sporting, the rings. The Olympic rings were such a big deal. And that was his work. But he used silkscreen. And I was exposed to silkscreen through this artist. His name was Rick Rush. And we did big images for like the NFL and all blah, blah, blah. There's different type of sporting things too. But when I worked for Rick, I was making $2.75 an hour. And I had to decide if I wanted milk or bread. Couldn't buy milk and bread. After a year of that, I figured out, okay, I think I can go back home to Mississippi and figure out a way to try to make a living with this. But it took my parents' support, of course, set up my silkscreen press in my grandmother's basement. I had about 6-foot clearance of headroom, and the fumes were so bad they would waft up through the floorboards. And when my grandmother's little PEO meetings were happening, they were all just sort of nauseated and general malaise from the fumes. And
they were floating out of those meetings.
They were floating, yes. So after a while, my grandmother, Mimi, graciously said, do you think you could find another place for your studio? So the hunt was on. And by this time, I had started beginning to not make a living, I wouldn't say, but having some income.
Do you remember the first piece you sold?
Oh, of course I do. Well, it was probably some portrait of somebody's dog, because that's what people paid for back then, right? I'll paint anything for $1. And that was professional career. That was just, oh, you can draw? Then will you paint my dog?
We got a birthday coming up.
Exactly. Yes. So the first thing I sold, I had silkscreened a photograph of a gentleman sitting outside of it's like an abandoned gas station or something. It was just a everyday scene from my studio neighborhood at the time. I had screen printed the image. I think there was a dog in the foreground or something, and I brought all these bright colors to it. So when I say silkscreen from the photograph, think about Andy Warhol, right? So we're talking about high contrast, black and white as a base. So these, instead of using images like Marilyn Monroe or Elvis Presley or soup cans or whatever like he did, I'm bringing in these everyday scenes from the community that surrounded my studio, predominantly a Black community that was, my neighbors, really. When I first turned my camera to that neighborhood, I had started a project called Avenue for Art. And it was focusing on bringing art to the kids that lived around my studio. So here I was, 23 years old. I got a small community block grant. I think it was like $500 or something for an 8-week class with the kids. They were 8 to 12 years of age. And they literally would ride up on their bicycles, and they're like, what do you do? Well, I'm a painter. Well, we want to paint. Great. Well, let's figure out how we can organize this. And I had a fairly large studio at the time. It was cheap, but it was large, big warehouse thing. And I put masking tape on the concrete floor in my studio and gave every kid like a 2x3 foot little square. We're talking 50 kids.
Wow.
And then sometimes there'd be a cousin or a baby sister on somebody's hip. We'd have 3 to 4-year-olds too. It's like they'd rush in, we'd tell them to go sit. And by this time I had enlisted other artists from the studio neighborhood. And we were just trying to expose these kids to what was possible when you create something and then potentially to be able to sell it. So we would create these cool masks. We did mask making and totem poles and go around the neighborhood and pick up garbage, pick up trash, take it back to the studio and ink it. And we'd do 2 things. We'd be cleaning up the neighborhood and then creating and learning about composition and negative space and color by printmaking from these objects that we found. And then the kids, we would have a gallery opening at the end of the 8 weeks, we would invite the neighborhood and the larger community. I mean, the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi would come and his wife. I mean, it was really very, I don't know. It was high-end fun for the neighborhood. It was really cool. And all my friends would come. And as soon as somebody new walked through the door, they would be rushed. Buy my picture. Buy my picture. It was just like,
brilliant.
Sales technique going on that was fairly, straightforward. Like, buy my picture. We would sell everything. And just as other galleries, we would give the kids half, 50% to the artists and 50% to the gallery to fund the project. And it was just a great time. And I mean, these kids were so dear to me. They never had this kind of exposure before to that level of artwork. And then to see that they created something and could sell it.
Yeah, just the look on the face is just, I did this, something totally different to what they was used to doing. That's amazing. How long did that last for?
5 years, I guess, probably, until I started traveling more and began to do art shows around the country that I couldn't be there. And the neighborhood changed. It was very transient, and the kids got older and just a lot of stuff going on. But those early days, walking down the street, inviting the kids to come to class and everybody, hey, Chris, take my picture, and I became part of the neighborhood. And it's the impetus that started my entire vision of my work.
So in 2005, Hurricane Katrina hits. A lot of the news reports, certainly the reports focused on New Orleans, but it was much wider spread and had a massive effect on the state of Mississippi. I believe you was out doing a lot of the exhibitions at the time it all unfolded, and people were saying, you as a native of Mississippi, you should get down there and document it.
Yep.
How do you prepare for a trip like that, which will become your project Backyards and Beyond?
Well, actually, there was very little preparation because it all happened so quickly. Even now in 2022, when people see my work that represents the Backyards and Beyond project and hear the word Hurricane Katrina, or they see the work, they're like, where'd you get these images of New Orleans? It's like, no, Mississippi was completely annihilated by a natural disaster, by the hurricane, the winds and the water, before New Orleans even flooded a day and a half, 2 days later. Mississippi was already gone. All 90 miles of our Gulf Coast looked like an atomic bomb had been dropped on it. Houses were what they call slabbed. They had a 32-foot wall of water go slamming into the Gulf Coast, cross, and then come back. All the backwater, everything swelled, and they had water where they'd never expected water. There's a highway called I-10 about 7 miles from the coast. That's where they had the 32-foot wall of water. Mark went over the tops of the pine trees. It was like something that had never been seen before. And always talked about Mississippi pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and we dealt with Hurricane Katrina, and we didn't expect anybody else to come deal with us. But it was such a different experience than New Orleans. I mean, New Orleans was a governmental failure to protect and continue to maintain the levees around New Orleans, or to even provide proper escape routes, ways for people that didn't have the means to be able to get out when New Orleans flooded. Tragic. Yeah, it was just a completely different experience. And as you briefly said, I was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is a long way, from those of you in the UK, from the Mississippi Gulf Coast, 1,600 miles maybe. But 2 to 3 days of driving to get up there to where I was doing this show. And yet it was that show in Pennsylvania where people locally were coming out and pulling themselves away from our 24-hour news cycle of New Orleans and what was happening. And finally, everybody were just like, I can't take it anymore. So they came to experience an arts festival. So here I was, and people kept saying, wow, you're from Mississippi? You need to be at home documenting what is happening. This is a national disaster. This is all happening in your own backyard. You need to go home. So next week out, I was in Washington, D.C., and a female attorney, I don't know who she was, she came in the booth and she said, Chris, I don't know what you need to do, but you need to go home and allow your work to document what is happening on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Your work speaks so well of Mississippi. Go home. I was like, oh my gosh, okay, I think I got it. I left. I had collaborator Carol Sessoms was with me. We went to the Gulf Coast. About a week later, we contacted one of our congressmen. We got the papers we needed, had my camera in hand, and for the first time, had the idea to pair my work with audio to create this multimedia of you're standing in front of a painting of an individual in an environment. I usually call them environmental portraits. So you're not just experiencing a person up close, it's where they are that's telling the story. So for this time to have a cheap, like cassette, probably, I can't remember, tape recorder to interview people standing in the muck and the mud and the stench of what had been their home. But as Mississippians, we love to talk. So it's not going to matter. And as a native Mississippian, they were open to me for sure. To them, I wasn't some stranger coming in to want to talk to them.
You wasn't just some news anchor wanting to get a scoop.
Right. So they shared, and this was August the 29th, 2005. So again, I hit the beach or the community a couple of weeks after that, the Gulf Coast. People were already trying to get into their homes, following the crews in, cutting the trees down. I mean, it was just literally like a bomb had gone off. And we were right there with them. And lo and behold, by the time we got into some of these, I'll say, backwoods communities, those people were already there. They weren't waiting for anybody to cut trees down. They had already found their way to figure out what was going on in their house. I mean, we had one girl, she was able to keep one piece that survived that had been like a 6-year-old birthday gift. And it's the only thing out of her entire bedroom that she was able to find. Everything was washed through the woods everywhere. But she said, we tried to get my horse up into the attic to save her horse, but they couldn't get it to happen. But people were doing some crazy things to try to just survive, and too many stories.
Yeah. How long was you down there for?
That's what I was going to say, a year. I had a small little camper, an RV. So I was able to come and go. Jackson is about 2 hours from the Mississippi coast, 2.5 hours. So I could go spend a week down there. The infrastructure was completely gone. I mean, there was no water services, no anything. So that's why staying in my RV, even though I didn't always know where I was because there was nothing, I could maintain. And I remember going to a fire station and they had access to some water. And if you know anything about camping, you have like a little holding tank and you can put water in so you can take a shower and stuff. And the fireman's like, well, if you break out in these little tiny red itchy bumps, we just call that Katrina rash. Like, oh, great. Something to look forward to. So,
yeah, thanks for the heads up.
Exactly. Nobody ever tells you when you're an artist and you go through art school that having a children's art class might change your life forever, or documenting a community in the wake of a natural disaster will be something that you will talk about for the rest of your life. And again, that was in 2006. The show, it took me 2 years to paint everything. The show didn't come together until 2008. There were 81 portraits in the show paired with the oral histories. So the recordings from all these individuals, you didn't hear just storm stories. You heard stories about people from the UK that came over and helped rebuild, maybe tore their sheetrock out of if they had a house left, helped in a million different ways. So it wasn't just the storm stories. That's why I wanted to stay down there for a year, not just the shock and awe of everything, but to get some of the rebirth to put this project together. And it was a huge project. It was sponsored by AT&T and Mississippi Power and the state of Mississippi. And all 81 of the portraits existed and were sold before they even came into being. So from the photographs, we got this idea to do kind of a lottery. I set up 4 different price points with 4 different sizes of the paintings. And you could jump in as a collector and say, okay, I want to spend this much. And if you had been the first person to buy into a certain size, you were the first person to pick out of those 20 photographs which image would become your painting. And then that was moved, and then there would be 19 paintings left. And somebody, had committed to that. So they got the second choice. We had people going on their honeymoon in Memphis, Tennessee in the airport, like, okay, we want we want this one and whatever. But it was amazing. There are 38 different states with collectors represented that were sponsors of paintings from the show. It was amazing to have that kind of support. And that came from years and years and years of showing my work all over the country and having these personal relationships with collectors. And it's one thing to be an artist and show with a gallery, right? Some people can't do what I do as an artist. They're just too introverted, or they can't be distracted in that way. And yet I represent my work to people all the time. So people I think they connect to me as much as they connect to the work a lot of times, if that makes sense.
That must have been a massive undertaking, 81 different paintings. Did it all have like a deadline or a timeline to get it completed?
Yes. And unfortunately, the deadline was so huge and so looming that they moved me out of my studio that I use all the time to a 40-acre campus of an Episcopal church that was a boarding school that had been closed, that a friend was on the board. She's like, I think we can get you over there. I was by myself day and night. All I did was paint. A friend would call and say, hey, what number painting are you on? I'm like, I'm on number 45, and I'd have to go to 81. So it was just this thing, but I would not change one single brushstroke on any of the paintings at all. When the show came together, and to stand in the middle of all of it, Mississippi Power sponsored as many of the families that we could find. So many people lost their home, they moved on. Of the 81, we had over 50 families at the opening. It was amazing. It was so much fun to see them. Here we are 3 years later, they're looking at themselves in that moment of that loss.
Hearing themselves as well.
And hearing themselves. Exactly. The kids in the images are 3 years older. So you go from 6 to 9. I mean, it's just a whole different experience. And one thing, they knew they were going to survive it. When you're looking at the image 3 years later, it's like, wow, that's what I walked through. Oh, yeah. Hand me a Kleenex,
Was the little boy from, is it The Protector? I think that one raised a bit of controversy. Did he come out and see the exhibition?
He was there. Yes, he was there. The Protector was there. The little boy that's with the ironing board on the front cover of actually on the book, he was there. I know there was another little boy, Brandon, was there. And some of the images, I don't want to hang on this too long, but some of the images were of the Vietnamese community on the coast because we have so much shrimping and fishing and all that. So we had to have an interpreter with us to help when we interviewed to know what they were saying and what story we were actually telling. It was life-changing as an artist and, of course, for the state of Mississippi and the community. So many people said if you ever say the word Katrina or hurricane, they won't be anywhere close to the Mississippi coast. Because we had, of our 73 counties, I think it was like 45 were considered disasters. So like all the way up half of our state, it spawned 200 tornadoes. You guys may not know what I'm even talking about, but tornadoes off of the hurricane.
That's unreal because, you could probably fit the UK or at least England into Mississippi. You could probably squash it in probably twice. So considering that much of it was devastated is hard to imagine, really. It really is. But your next big undertaking, though, was the Blues at Home project, I believe. But that idea didn't originally start as a music thought, though, was it? Was it you got the idea after driving by a trailer park?
Yes. And do y'all understand what a trailer park is? It's just this collection of community where people have found it's more affordable to live in a small little trailer than it is to have a brick home or whatever. And this particular community, I had gone up to the Delta in Mississippi, which is a couple of hours from where I am. We're kind of the low end of the Delta. The Delta runs from Memphis, Tennessee, down to Vicksburg, which is where I am, and then west into Arkansas and Louisiana. But I had gone up to Delta State, a university there, and we had installed the Katrina project. I'd done like a Saturday afternoon talk. And on the way back, I was driving, sun setting over the Delta, which is all flat cotton fields. And it's just really beautiful. And I thought, as I passed this trailer park in Rolling Fork, which is where Muddy Waters is from originally, right? So this huge history of blues. But the trailer park was like, Chris. I mean, it absolutely called my name. It was just like freaky. I was by myself. It's like, Chris. It's like, what?
Like Field of Dreams or something like that?
Yes. You need to do a project about this Rolling Fork trailer park. And I called my then gallery director, Lachlan Fields, and I said, Lachlan, I'm going to do a project about this trailer park. And Chris, no, we're going to tell the story of the music that's come out of the fertile soil of the Mississippi Delta. Oh, that's awesome. Okay, we'll do that. So I have yet to get back to my trailer park. I hope to one day.
You got to see what the clientele of that trailer park are going to be like.
Oh my gosh, there must be huge stories there. And I will tell them one day. There's no telling, but I just have to get back to it. So maybe that would be a good thing after COVID. We'll see. But then try to figure out, okay, great concept. Let's talk about the blues artists. I didn't want to do it just from the Delta. I wanted to tell the different types of blues stories that come out of all the different areas of the state. So you got the hill country blues, piney wood blues. So there's all these different types of blues. And now you identify the musicians you want in the project. Okay. How do we do that? We work with the scholars at the universities, the blues scholars, the Blues Commission for the state of Mississippi, and they tell us, okay, you need this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, because I'm not a musician. I'm an artist. I'm a visual storyteller. Well, they're storytellers with their music, and I'm storytelling with my art. And how do we bring that artist's patrons and community into a place where they can recognize and understand the blues through art? Let's open this up to patrons that might not normally be drawn to the blues. Let's give them an understanding. So it's called Blues at Home. I didn't want to be in some audience at a blues festival, right? I wanted it to be kind of behind the scenes personal. So how are we going to get into their homes? Then, if it wasn't their home, someplace significant in their career, or someplace we would photograph them that had a real sense of place about the blues. And people would say, well, why isn't Muddy Waters in the project? Well, Muddy Waters has been dead for a long time, and my work is based on my personal photography. So I have to photograph somebody living. Well, Honey Boy Edwards was my oldest blues man at 97 years of age. Supposedly, he was there when Robert Johnson, the famous blues man that sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads, was poisoned in the juke joint. Supposedly, Honey Boy was there. Well, Honey Boy is from Mississippi, and that was the other thing. They wanted him to be from Mississippi, not from somewhere, not Louisiana or wherever. So he has always called Chicago his home, but he was home in Mississippi. And that was the thing. How do you photograph these guys? They got to be home in the state. And then you got to find someplace interesting to do it. So I took him in Meridian, Mississippi. I think it's the oldest restaurant in the state of Mississippi, consecutively running like 125 years, something crazy. So I photographed Honey Boy there. And then many of them, I was in their home. Some of them were in famous juke joints like the Queen of Hearts or Po Monkeys outside of Cleveland. And it was just an adventure. So for one solid year, and it's been a while, it's been 10 years ago when I photographed everybody. And then it took me a couple of years to create the paintings. And we also paired them with oral histories. So how fun when you start telling somebody, oh my gosh, you're going to be able to hear Terry Harmonica Bean. You're going to stand in front of this painting of him and hear him tell you where he was from in Mississippi, how he came to the blues, hear some of his music, all in like a 60 to 90 second clip. I mean, we're not trying to wear anybody out with this thing. So, you want to just hear a little snippet from everybody. And each time we opened the show at a different venue, first time the state of Mississippi sponsored as many of the guys that could be there of the 31. We had like 16 of them there. Everybody, including Bobby Rush. Unfortunately, Honey Boy Edwards had already passed away. I had wanted Pinetop Perkins, who was a piano player. I'd wanted him in the project. He was still living at the time. We set up the photo shoot and he passed away like 2 weeks before I was supposed to shoot him, which is, it's a loss for me and for the project, but Honey Boy's gone on bigger and better, but he would have been my oldest. I think he was 98 at the time.
I say you interviewed these people, you took photos of them, but then whilst you're putting it together, we unfortunately lost a lot of these musicians. But what a nice way of, I guess, inspiring you to pay tribute to them.
Well, I think we've lost 13 now, and it's incredible. And not all of them were as old as Honey Boy. So to look through the Blues at Home images and to see so many of these incredible musicians and just storytellers and historians and what they do.
Who was the biggest character? I'm sure there was a lot of them. That's hard to choose.
They all have a swagger. They're all entertainers. I mean, at their heart. I mean, they put the bluesman hat on and they got the shoes and they got the suit. And that's what it is. I had to ask these guys, how does it feel to be a Mississippi blues man when you get to go to Norway to the blues festival or France or Israel or the UK? And
probably like heralded as like gods or legends when they get over there. Then they come back to Mississippi and it's just back to normal.
Yep. I was photographing T-Model Ford and it was like February. Travels all over the world. And he was heating his home with his 4-burner stove. I mean, it's just really like, well, he also fathered 26 children. So I think his money was elsewhere. It's like, I can't afford heat. because I got to pay for all my kids.
Your links to the blues goes right back to the early 80s, though, when you went to a blues night at the Subway Lounge in Jackson.
Oh, my word.
What was it that made such an impact on you back then?
That's a secret. My father is not supposed to know that I went there.
Is that true? Did you sneak out?
Yes, he gave me explicit. You cannot go to the Subway not because it was, a mixed crowd, not because it was dangerous, it's in a bad part of the town. No, it's because the building was leaning and it was an old hotel and the Subway was in the basement. So your ceiling was like right here. Everybody would pound on the ceiling. You could reach it. At any moment, the whole thing could have just imploded and we would all be buried in there with the famous blues guy, probably either Jesse Robinson, or at the time there was a guy called the 500 Pounds of Blues. It was something. We were part of history in that you would go next door. There was a little house that would raise a window sash. Because this is after hours. Everybody had to play in all the legitimate clubs until 1 or 2. And then they would go to the Subway Lounge. So there wasn't like a bar. You had to go next door.
Tell me this was on like a Friday or a Saturday. It wasn't on like a weeknight.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
No, Friday or Saturday. And I was in college by this time. It wasn't like I was 12, running around. So they would raise this window and you would buy a bucket of ice with beer sitting in it. And then you would take it back over and go down the stairs into the basement. Fun times. And I swear there was a sign that said occupancy 40 people. And we thought that meant 40 Black people and 40 white people. That was the way it was, because that's how mixed and integrated, the crowd was. We all had a great time. And yet it was way, 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 way more than just 40 bodies in this place. So it was, you can't compete with any kind of experience like that.
Has music been a bit of a soundtrack to you when you do artwork at all? Has music always been important to you?
Isn't that funny? That's a great question. I've had people ask me, of course, if I was a musician, if I play guitar or whatever. And I love music, but to be honest, that's not where I really find my inspiration. I love the blues. When my studio was still in my grandmother's basement, I was doing silkscreen posters, 5 and 6 color designs for the Delta Blues Festival. And it would be on a Saturday in the Delta in September, the third weekend of September, always. Amazing lineup. I'm sure I saw legends of the blues that I have just kind of didn't mean anything to me back then as a 21, 22-year-old. But that's where I really found my love of the blues. And I think it was the love of the community. You're surrounded by cookers, barbecuing, and dancing together. That was the love. So that was my experience of the blues. And I've continued to love to go to blues clubs. There was a place called the 930 Blues Cafe in Jackson, Mississippi. And it happened to be owned by a lawyer. Jackson's gentleman had been from the Mississippi Delta and he wanted to give back to community. And he himself had come up sort of out of the cotton fields. He was a Black attorney. He'd done very well. He was on the board of the Mississippi Museum of Art. We were friends and I would go in there. But when I started the Blues at Home project and we went to photograph T-Model Ford in Greenville, Mississippi, T-Model's wife was watching the photo shoot. And after a few minutes, she looked over and she said, "I've seen you dance at the 930 Blues." And I was like, "Oh, no, Stella, no. Do you remember that?" I mean, that would have been years and years and years and years before this whole photo shoot was happening. And then that she had that in her mind. I was like, oh, my God.
You made an impression.
I made an impression of sorts. There's no telling.
How has your style developed with the growth of digital photography and also with the likes of photo editing? Do you still use the silkscreen? Is that still part of your process or can that be done digitally now?
That is a great question too. And yes, I had just purchased my first digital camera when Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005. So I'd had my camera for about 6 months and it changed the way that I photographed the environment. And I could not have captured the images that I did with the Katrina project if I had not had my digital camera. It was amazing to be able to, like, when my collaborator Carol was recording the oral histories with the subjects, I was shooting the environment, looking for that sort of story that I wanted to tell by placing them there, right? So I could take a shot and look at it, say, oh, yeah, that works. That'll be great. So let's do that. And I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do, photographers were doing it for a century without it, but it was great for me. And then I started silk screening using a copy camera the way that Andy Warhol did to capture your image on line film, and you do different exposures of time to capture different levels of detail in the image. So you could expose something for 10 seconds, and on your film you might have an eye, a faces, more of a face detail, and then you'd have to expose it for 15 seconds and might get something in their hand or whatever. So I would do all these different exposures and cut out what I wanted and literally tape it all together for my exposure into my screen. And now that's all done on Photoshop. So it's like the horse and buggy. Literally, you don't have to do that anymore. I can now digitally pull out in my different parts of my photograph and take that image to the level that I want it to be, make one master, silk screen that, and then hand paint back on top of that. So I get to bring all my bright colors back into the black and whites using acrylic paint and Prismacolor pencil. I paint in complementary colors, under front colors. So it's not just flat. You get all this painting happening, plus the line work from the pencils and lots of movement to the paint. And it really gives sort of a voice to the images that's in addition to just what that base photographic kind of image is saying.
How do you see the digital world affecting the future of art? Some people just do everything on a tablet now because you can get all the brushes to do it direct on there. I just see you losing a little bit of that. I don't know if it's the tactile element, but going back to when you was teaching the kids and going out on the street and getting trash and painting stuff and that physical element of it. Do you think that'll be missed, or do you think there's always going to be a place for that?
Well, that's kind of a complicated question because I'm, at this point in my career, I'm kind of really steeped in my process, I guess. I'm committed to what I do and how I do it. So I like to bring other younger artists in and to be around to know, okay, this is really cool. You're doing that with digital photography. You're doing that with photo transfer. You're doing that with encaustic and whatever. But I'm not really a great, I'm kind of a stick in the mud stalwart for what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it. And I won't stop until everybody in the entire world has an H.C. Porter painting. That's my goal. Just kidding. But it'd be nice. But again, I'm just fortunate that I felt and was exposed to silkscreen when I was. It's kind of having a rebirth. It's interesting. I was doing an artist in residence. I was in Annapolis, Maryland for the last few years. And I kept hearing silkscreen. You do silkscreen? Wow, that's great. I'm taking a silkscreen course over at whatever art thing. So it's really kind of getting a hook again. Of course, I use oil-based ink and lacquer thinner and paint, all this stuff that's just horrible for you. So, I'm still here. I have to wear a big respirator and everything, but it's what we do for art.
What's next for you? Because I think you did some early work with, going back to the beginning, you did some stuff with Vicksburg National Park. Is that something that's going to develop into a next exhibition, or is that on hold, or is the other stuff going off?
Well, that's interesting. Like we were speaking about the history of the park. It's a national park, just like Glacier National Park or Yellowstone in the States. So people come to it. We get over 1 million visitors a year, and the park is only 2 miles. I don't know how far that is from me, downtown in the historic downtown kind of shopping district where my gallery is now. How do I move those people those 2 miles to come into the gallery and be exposed to my work? And that's when we put the project together to document not just what happened in Vicksburg, but the Civil War history in general. So I worked with historic photographs, created a first initial image, put it into merchandise and everything. It was sold at the visitor center in the park. But I had just finished the second image when COVID hit, and it kind of has just sort of stalled. But every national park has been closed. This one just reopened in May, and they're just now getting kind of back together. But that's been an interesting thing. I don't know. I'd love to sort of do a release of a commemorative image every year, see if we can tap into those crazy historians out there that love to, Civil War history and want to live with it on their walls. So more power to them.
Total full circle for you when you first started coming to Vicksburg, just on those little history trips at school. And then you ended up living in Vicksburg and working on stuff like that.
Exactly. And I would, in my wildest years and days and dreams, I would have never thought I would have ended up in Vicksburg, Mississippi. I was doing an art show when I was looking at this building and thinking, I'm an artist. I can't afford a building. How would I do it? And I was doing a little show and a patron came in. I wasn't even in Jackson. I was somewhere in Mississippi, but they said, aren't you H.C. Porter? Aren't you from Vicksburg? It was just a random elderly woman. H.C. Porter, aren't you from? And I was like, okay, God, I got it. I guess I'm moving to Vicksburg. I don't know. It was just like this direct line of, you're going to Vicksburg. It's like, okay. Yeah, it was just like a weird, wow. I've never even thought about going to Vicksburg. And here's this woman telling me that that's synonymous with my name.
I love it. Thanks ever so much for chatting with me. I'm stoked we got it hooked up.
Oh, it's awesome. Well, I hope I gave you more than you need so you can edit and do. And
no, it's been great.
Okay, see you around the world.
Thank you so much to HC Porter for taking some time out of her busy schedule to chat all the way to me here in the UK, right here on the Straight to Video podcast. I hope her story makes you want to learn a little bit more about her work, so head on over to hcporter.com or on Facebook where you can find out all the information you need. This and close to 170 episodes of the podcast can all be found at stvpod.com, where you may well be listening from now, or perhaps you listen on one of the many podcast platforms, but please be sure to like, follow or subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Your support is massive, and I hope you're enjoying all these different chats I bring to you every Tuesday and Friday. I got some more real fun ones on the way over the next week or two, so please keep coming back, sharing your thoughts and comments, and I can't wait to chat again real soon.